Hello, everybody. It's Andrea, and I know it's been a long time. These podcasts actually take three things. They take inspiration, which I don't always have, time, which I don't always have, and energy, which I don't always have. So they come together when all three things come together. I'm also, lately, I find the news a bit dispiriting, and I've been thinking about renaming this podcast from American Thinker Takeaways, things you should take away after listening to the podcast, to "'Tis folly to be wise." After the little rhyme, "If ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise." Because sometimes, honestly, I wish I were one of those people who never read the news and just thought everything was fine because I have no idea what's going on. But that's not who I am. So, having said that, let's get started. The first thing I wanted to discuss was the shutdown ending. It was inevitable that it would end. First of all, because the SNAP benefits weren't going to be an issue for anybody but the SNAP beneficiaries who are the Democrat base regardless. What was going to be an issue was when the flights stopped. And I was afraid that the Republicans would cave. I was delighted to see that it was the Democrats that caved when the flight stops. A part of that was because they got what they wanted, which was a lot of headlines to drive the base out in blue areas on Election Day. And it was not a disaster for Republicans. It would have been nice if Winsome Sears had won in Virginia, or if Jack, what's his name again, had won in New Jersey, but those are both basically blue areas. The fact that Glenn Youngkin had won, I think I got that name right, was because of an anomalous cycle revolving around education. But those are bluer than blue areas. And I will admit that the lockdown, the shutdown where a lot of government employees were affected, may have helped put Spanberger in office. So I'm not discounting that she won because of that, and that Jay Jones, who would like to kill his opponents and spit on their graves or urinate on their graves and watch their children die, also won. And it was helped because government workers, and to any of you who are listening who are conservatives, my apologies, government workers tend to be fiery Democrat partisans, which means that we, the American people, are funding them. That's bad. But a friend reminded me that another reason the Democrats had to stop the shutdown was because the president's power grows at a certain point. And so I went to ChatGPT to find out specifically how that power grows. It's not that he is simply handed emergency powers, but ChatGPT gave a few reasons why a party that doesn't like the president doesn't want his power to grow. As ChatGPT says, a long shutdown does expand the president's practical leverage. At a certain point, and my friend said it's 42 days, and I will take her statement as truth because she's usually right about things. In fact, I can't think of a thing she's been wrong about so far. Anyway, at a certain point, the executive branch gets to decide which employees are essential and must report to work. We've already seen that with the FAA employees. Which government functions continue, how agencies ration their limited capacities, what accepted regulatory or law enforcement actions proceed, and which services are curtailed first. And we saw that again with the FAA, with the flight people and making sure planes land. And it's been a long day and I'm getting word blank, so I'm just going to work around that. With every passing day, the president gets more power in those areas. The really important part, as ChatGPT says, is that the president will control what parts of the government go dark. And that's under the Anti-Deficiency Act. So agencies may not spend money without congressional appropriations, but they have to continue activities involving protection of human life, protection of property, national security, certain foreign policy operations, activities funded by mandatory appropriations. Everything else, says ChatGPT, is paused. And so it comes to the executive branch determining what is absolutely essential. So the TSA, air traffic control, absolutely essential. But a whole lot of things the Trump administration is not going to consider essential. So that was beginning to be a problem for the Democrats as the shutdown continued. Finally, ChatGPT says long shutdowns magnify executive power simply because Congress is paralyzed, can't do anything, because there's no one to sign bills, even if Congress can pass it. So the executive has more and more power over how the government operates, and Congress has less and less power because there's nothing it can do. It was inevitable that the shutdown would continue. I consider it, aside from those elections in blue districts where they did get out the base, I consider the shutdown a major failure for the Democrats for one very specific reason, which it made Americans aware of the problems with SNAP. Americans are a generous people. We understand that in a ginormous country, people will slip down the cracks, even between the cracks, even if there's private charity. But so it's okay. In a huge city, you're not going to have a small community rallying around the widows and orphans. So we will shift functions to government. But what became very clear to people during the lockdown was that SNAP is a lifestyle, that it's way too easy, that it is subject to enormous fraud, especially by the Somali community, which has made a business of fraud across Somali communities, mostly in Minnesota, that people have no gratitude, and that a lot of the people doing the complaining were doing so on $1,000 phones. So I think it was a fail for the Democrats because it showed one more area of the government that's being grossly abused. The other topic I want to discuss is the elections, and there's only one point I want to make, and it was actually a point that someone made in a comment, and I'd love to give that person credit. If you're listening, I wish I could give you credit. As many people who leave comments have discovered, our commenting system is less than desirable. Some of it is that they object to the fact that comments are put into moderation when they have certain words or variations on certain words, things that are fighting words, anti-Semitic words, racist words, seditious words. They all have to go through moderation. Our AI, commenting AI, is not smart enough to figure out context, so I moderate them all. Or when I'm not working on Mondays, Greg Richter moderates them, or sometimes Mike McDaniel when he covers for me. And we're not always on 24/7, so there can be a delay. But the other problem is that there's a horrible search function at the back end, and I couldn't find this comment. And what the comment said, apropos everybody going, oh my God, Zohran Mamdani's going to destroy New York. He said something, or she said something very interesting, which is there's very little left to destroy. New York used to be a hub. It was a manufacturing hub. It was a trade hub. It was, this commenter had a list of things that made New York City really important to the American economy. Eventually, all that was left was that New York was a marketplace hub, not a marketplace of tangibles, but a marketplace of the intangible of money. And then this person said something very important. That mattered when there were trading floors. You had Chicago and New York. Now everything is really done electronically. The trading floor, I believe it still exists, but it's a relic. With money being traded electronically, New York no longer adds value to America. It may be symbolic. It may have a lot of people living in it. It may be a tourist destination, although it will become less of one as it becomes ever dirty and more dangerous and more of a third world vibe. But in terms of its importance to the American economy, that's the stock market. Doesn't need to be in New York. So the rich people are going to flee. The stock market is going to flee with it. And New York, believe it or not, will sink into Detroit-like irrelevance. Nothing lasts forever, and things that commit suicide die faster. Here's another political topic. It's a real quick throwaway. It's from Just the News, and the headline is Ted Cruz schedules hearing on impeaching rogue federal judges. The first paragraph, which is the only thing I copied, reads, Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Federal Courts Oversight, Agency Action, and Federal Rights Chairman Ted Cruz on Monday scheduled a hearing on the possibility of impeaching rogue federal judges. We've all seen that the federal judges are completely out of control. They are making rulings that go far beyond their jurisdiction. They're doing those nationwide injunctions. They're not interested in the facts. They're not interested in the law. And very interestingly, I have been practicing law, although I retired some time ago, but I started practicing law in 1987. And one of the things we were told is judges hate being overruled. It is humiliating for a trial or appellate court judge to be overruled by a court superior to it. That is gone. There is no sense of shame anymore in being overruled. These rogue justices care only about halting the Trump agenda, about imposing damage on the MAGA agenda, about doing anything they can to be a spoke in the wheel. There are no constraints on them anymore. The only constraint is impeachment. The problem with impeachment is that I believe, and I may be wrong, but I think it may take more than 51 votes in the Senate for a federal judge to be impeached. And you're never going to get more than 51 unless every conservative in America turns out and votes. We are seeing a culture shift. I hope it lasts. I don't know if it will, but I've got some evidence. If you're looking at the screen, it is a screen grab of the YouTube page for the November 9th Saturday Night Live sketch entitled Sorority Meeting. I don't want to show it to you because I don't know how far I can go before I get accused of copyright violations. So this is just the YouTube page. It's not a very funny sketch because the writing is not clever. It's not witty. But it starts with an announcement by the sorority team leader or whatever it's called to a room full of girls that they have a problem on campus, which is that fraternity boys are sneaking into sororities by wearing super good female masks. And then you pan over the couch and you notice that one of the girls sitting on the couch has a latex face and no boobs and is clearly a guy. She asks the other girls to speak up if there's a problem. One of the girls speaks up and says, I think that girl, Linda or whatever, is actually a fraternity guy. The skit goes on from there with all the girls attacking this woman for daring to complain about this anomalous sorority girl who, in her first year in the sorority, organized 15 bikini-only car washes and sat and watched them with a towel on her lap. They make it all about fraternity boys. It's not funny. It's not well written. I think, though, it represents a cultural shift because it is clearly, very clearly, an attack on transgender women, which means mentally ill men, in women's only spaces. I found it notable. Another sign of cultural shift, which is the return to normal American shopping values. According to the Daily Mail, this is a story saying Target makes disturbing demand. I'll just say Daily Mail comes out of England, but a lot of what's wrong with our culture is driven by the media. Because to someone like me who was raised in the 1960s, and 1970s, even though those were hippie eras, and then the 1970s, the Me Too self-actualization, self-realization eras, they were still largely dominated by traditional 1950s American values because the adults in the room were very often still the greatest generation. So back to the headline, Target makes disturbing demand of staff in a bid to boost flagging sales. And critics are saying another reason to shop elsewhere. So what are Target's demands? Here I'm going to quote again. 'Tis the season to be jolly, especially if you work at Target. The retailers want employees to keep their spirits bright and their smiles tighter as the holiday rush hits full speed. Indeed, Target has imposed new rules on employees in an effort to spark some festive cheer up and down the superstore's aisles. Employees were told that if a shopper comes within 10 feet of them, they must smile. If they, meaning the shopper, come closer, within 4 feet, employees must ask whether they need help or how their day is going, according to Bloomberg. Then ... Other retailers have created similar rules, such as Walmart with its 10-foot rule, requiring employees to greet customers, make eye contact, and offer assistance when they come close. Response to the news online has been critical. It used to be that when you went into a store, customer service meant being cheery and bright and saying hello and offering a smile. Certainly, the stores I go to, for example, Harris Teeter, where I do my grocery shopping, they're always friendly, and I'm friendly right back. I've also noticed that friendliness is contagious, which is a big thing of mine, because I believe in an atomized, angry world. Each of us has an almost moral obligation to be friendly. And I've noticed that I chit-chat with the clerk. When I'm done, the person behind me, 9 out of 10, will also be friendly. It is very much creating a mindset in which friendliness and respect are the norm, but the cultural watchdogs in the media and on social media, which it means people who complain a lot, say that this is just practically fascist to dare to expect a store to treat its customers well. The final thing, and this is a really interesting one because of course it sparked outrage. Let me say preliminarily, Timothy Chalamet or Chalamet or whatever his name is, I've seen him in 2 Dune movies, and I have to say I wasn't impressed. Probably I'm too old to appreciate his virtues. I'm about 35 or 40 years old to appreciate his virtues. He looked to me like an anemic little emo guy. Having said that, he sparked outrage. This is from the Daily Mail. Timothy, whatever his name is, Chalamet, is facing heat after insinuating that women choosing not to have children is bleak. His word, not mine. As Vogue's most recent cover star, the actor sat down with a reporter from the glossy fashion magazine and talked about his booming career and social life. But for many readers, one moment stuck out more than others. The 29-year-old recounted watching an interview with a friend in which the subject was, quote, bragging about not having kids. And I believe this is a quote from Chalamet. So he's relating that it was an interview with a friend in which the subject of the interview was, here I'm quoting Chalamet, bragging about not having kids and how much time it afforded them to do other stuff. He said his first thought, so we're going back to Chalamet talking to the Vogue interviewer, said his first thought was like, holy S word. Oh my God, bleak. The interviewer wrote that Chalamet, quote, knows some people can't have children or are never in a position to, but he does believe procreation is the reason we're here, close quote. Chalamet, and I'm back to now the Daily Mail, who has recently dated Kylie Jenner, told Vogue that he may be interested in having children of his own someday. Now let me add here, if he thinks procreation is the reason we're here, he better be interested in having children of his own someday. And where I cut off the article was Daily Mail writing, the comments to Vogue from Chalamet, who is known for his large female fan base, proved divisive for many. And then if you go to the Daily Mail article and keep reading, it's all about the absolute horror that Chalamet would think women should have children and that life without children may be lonely and bleak. But in fact, you might hear my dog bark in the background. He's 11.5 pounds of Chihuahua fury and love. He's my baby doggy, and everybody who knows me knows that. But he may be my baby doggy, and I call him my baby, but he's not my baby. I didn't want children, but I ended up having them, and it was the absolute best, most wonderful decision I ever made. And I do just know that some people can't have children or are never in a position to do so. I respect that. I do not denigrate those people. What I do denigrate is a generation of utterly narcissistic people who live only for themselves and their pleasures. In fact, that's why I had children, because I recognized that I was becoming an utterly narcissistic, self-centered, rigid person who lived only for herself and her pleasures. I did not want to be that person. We had family friends who were like that, and they were, I don't know why my parents stayed friends with them, because they knew them in Israel. They were tied to the past. They were utterly unpleasant people because they didn't have children not because they couldn't or were never in a position to do so. They didn't have children because they simply wanted to live life for themselves. And people like that aren't very nice. For me, children were the difference between being a good person and an awful person. Being a person who is kind 90% of the time and reserves her spleen for writing about politics, and a person who was rigid and judgmental. My children are in their late 20s now, and one or the other or both calls me almost every single day. I never call them. I never guilt them. I never say, why don't I hear from you? Because, of course, I always hear from them. They call me because they like me. And that's incredibly flattering. And it's especially flattering because it was a conscious effort on my part to be both an extremely good mother who gave them boundaries and guidance, and who is a likable person, so that when they transitioned to adulthood, I became someone whose company they enjoy and whose opinions they value. And I know I'm tooting my own horn, but motherhood was very difficult for me. I'm not a naturally nurturing person. It was a constant cognitive act. It was very, very challenging for me. And so I boast about the rewards I had for it. My life would have been very bleak had I not had them, because I would have been a sad, awful person. I recognize that not everybody is as rigid or self-centered as I was becoming, but the sad fact is, unless you are a person who will live for others, if you don't have children, you may find yourself sinking into being that person I didn't want to be. So again, I do not say that everybody must have children, that everybody can have children, that people who don't have children are awful people, that they have to have bleak lives. But I think Chalamet was right, and it reflects a cultural shift that he felt the courage to say that. So kudos to this young man who I don't care about as an actor, but who said something important. I'm now going to shift to overseas. I do not know why my dog is barking. If you can still hear him, he is obviously making demands, and they're not demands of me, so I'm ignoring them. So I stopped and checked. My dog is trying to bully someone. You cannot let a Chihuahua bully you. the If you ever saw Damn Yankees, you remember there was a song, whatever Lola wants, Lola gets. The Chihuahua version is whatever the Wawa wants, the Wawa gets. And my dog wants something, and he's not going to get it, so he's going to keep yelling. Anyway, I said I'm going to shift to overseas. This is where leftism goes. It's, again, about China being our geopolitical enemy, about it being willing to export its culture, which and its values, which America has refused to do pretty much since the Vietnam War, but especially since Obama, when Obama started going around telling everybody that America is no great shakes, and the left is all about we're being an awful country. Here's the headline. It's an article by Jim Hoft. South Korean far-left leader announces criticism of China or its ruling Communist Party will be treated as a criminal offense. If you read the article, that is a bit of an overstatement, but it's not a lot of an overstatement. According to a report by Minhwa Ilbo, South Korean President Lee Jae-myung's administration has announced a series of measures aimed at, quote, eliminating hate speech and misinformation. I don't know about you, but that sounds remarkably like something that would have come out of the Obama or Biden administration, when hate speech and misinformation tend to mean anything we, the Democrats, don't like. Picking up with the article, these include a proposed hate speech prevention law, mandatory removal of, quote, hateful content, close quote, from social media platforms such as YouTube, and even the automatic dismissal of public officials who express so-called, quote, hate speech, close quote. While no country was explicitly mentioned, many observers note that these moves are clearly intended to target the growing anti-China sentiment among Korean citizens. The ruling party is also pushing a, quote, ban on anti-China protests, close quote, bill, criminalizing criticism or mockery of a foreign nation or its citizens with penalties of up to 5 years in prison or 10 million in Korean money, which the name of which I forget, in fines. During a cabinet meeting, President Lee declared that hate speech and manipulated information, quote, must be treated as crimes that go beyond the limits of free expression, close quote, insisting that, quote, they, quote, must be severely punished as a threat to democracy, close quote. This is what Democrats want for America. It means the government controls speech. The government controls what is accurate and what is not accurate. The government does not have to prove criminal fraud. Private citizens do not have to prove defamation, libel, slander. If the government doesn't like it, it's misinformation. This is how all totalitarians work, and they do it to save democracy, meaning no longer demos or the people, because you heard about in this article growing anti-China sentiment among Korean citizens. This is about the government exerting its power over thought. This is 1984. Orwell wrote it in 1948. What's also interesting is that the Korean citizens elected this man despite growing anti-China sentiment. I was in the Far East on a 3-week vacation in 2017. That does not mean I know anything about the region. It means I know an infinitesimally small amount. I was in Vietnam, North and South, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. The one thing I can tell you is that everywhere I went, people expressed their hatred for the Chinese. Vietnam, which is technically a Chinese communist umbrella nation, they hate the Chinese. The Chinese are seen as disrespectful bullies. So I'm not surprised that in Korea there's anti-China sentiment, yet perhaps in a dishonest election, and I don't know, that's speculation based on nothing on my part, they elected a leader who hews to China. The other thing that I thought when I read this is so indescribably sad, because Americans and other once decent nations in the UN expended blood and treasure to protect at least South Korea from the Chinese. And the Chinese, long march through the institutions, they seem to be winning anyway. I want to talk about fat Palestinians. One of the things that is most frightening and disturbing in the world is rising anti-Semitism and the paired animus toward Israel. The hatred for Israel, people say, oh, you got to be able to correct governments and criticize governments and everything. If the only government you ever criticize is Israel, that's anti-Semitism. If the only country that you accuse of genocide during war, when there are true genocides in Turkey, in Sudan, in Somalia, in all sorts of places, but you can only talk about a genocide that Israel is committing against Gaza, that's anti-Semitic. If the only people who are creating problems in the world are the Jews, that's anti-Semitism. If Jews and Israel live rent-free in your head and are the source of all bad things, facts to the contrary, you are an anti-Semite. Well, one of the big anti Semitic blood libels was that during the war, despite the fact that Israel, unlike any country in the history of warfare, was feeding its enemies, it was sending hundreds, thousands of tons of food to its enemies. The big claim was that Israel was starving the Palestinian people to death. So it's notable that Daniel Greenfield, aka Sultan Knish, and one of the most brilliant people in the whole world of the internet, has written at front page, UN report shows Palestinians fatter than Israelis. But because the Israel haters never skip a beat. Okay, I'm going to inject something here. My mother was a great woman in many ways. She was also a very unhappy woman. She'd had a very bad life. And when she got old and there were no pleasures left in life, there was only sadness and hypochondria, and nothing could make her happy. One of the things that was really sad is that when one problem got fixed, she never took a moment to celebrate. She just shifted to another problem. So when she got a pacemaker, so she no longer had scary, irregular heartbeats, all we heard next about was how the pacemaker was so awful because it created an unsightly bulge under her clothes. I was thinking that when I read this article by Daniel Greenfield, because once this UN report established that the Israelis had not starved the Palestinians, the narrative shifted. There was no, oh, we're fine. We haven't been starved. There was no genocide. It's all good now. Sorry we defamed you and made the whole world hate you and want to kill you. There's a new narrative at play. I'm quoting Daniel here. I've met him. He's a lovely man. After 2 years of barraging social media with lies about a famine in Gaza, Hamas propaganda channels are now trying to cover up their obesity by claiming that Israel is making them fat. One recent Hamas media story clamored that, quote, they're forcing us to gain weight, close quote, and objected that supermarkets have, quote, shelves overflowing with chocolate, soft drinks, and cigarettes, close quote, along with unhealthy, quote, flour and various types of cheese used in sweets and pizza, in addition to sugar and flour derivatives used in confectionery production, close quote. An Arab Muslim settler in Gaza who had previously justified the Hamas massacres complained, quote, I am compelled to consume carbohydrates, processed cheese, and manufactured meat. What some are calling the fatocide reflects the reality that there was never a famine in Gaza, but there was a very real obesity problem. Past reports have found high rates of obesity among children and adults in Gaza, and a 2019 study found that almost half of adults over the age of 42 had type 2 diabetes. Let me interject here that is a staggering number, and it's borne out by the fact that, as you may recall at the beginning of the war, when Israel was starting to round up the first Hamas fighters that it had caught, many of them were obese, which makes it even more disgusting, the state of starvation and death by starvation that they imposed on the hostages. Even in the Middle Ages, when they took hostages from the battlefield, they treated them well until they were ransomed off. Anyway, back to the article. Another Gaza report cited Hamas Ministry of Health numbers claimed that 9.6% of the population in Gaza has diabetes, and it's a cause of 11.2% deaths. The fatocide is real, and it is claiming Palestinian lives every day. A study from a decade ago found that 1 out of every 5 adolescents in Gaza was overweight or obese, and most recent numbers from the combined terrorist-occupied territories of Israel, including Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, showed that around a third of boys and girls were obese. It goes on in this vein. I was going to read it to you, but you get the point. The point is that not only was the famine a lie, it was the biggest of big lies, because Palestinians have more food than any normal people should eat. Life there is a giant halal McDonald's. And so now that has been exposed, they're accusing Israel of giving them too much food. It's utterly insane. I don't have any more commentary to make. You are all smart people. You can draw your own conclusions. The final thing I want to talk about, entitle this little segment, Getting Right with God. I had a visit from an old friend, very dear friend, someone I like a great deal. It's a person I met almost 40 years ago through work, gay man, and he took a shine to me. He's been a good friend ever since. We had a lovely time with him, took him around town, showed him the sights, had meals with him, not complaining about him. Very near the end, he started making kind of nasty remarks about religion. We didn't pick up on it. He was about to leave for the airport. Not going to part on that note. I'm never going back to California. I don't know that he'll ever be here. I may never see him again. And he's a good friend, and it was a lovely visit, and I was not going to get into an argument with him. What I thought, though, was it used to be that people who lived lives that were out of alignment with core biblical strictures, and I'm not talking, for example, about Orthodox Jews and the 648 or whatever rules they have to follow. I'm talking about the big commandments, honor thy father and thy mother, and those kind of commandments, and then the sort of unspoken things that aren't commandments, but that are clear God rules. I say to you, choose life and be fruitful and multiply, which oppose abortion, or all the hostility to homosexual sex, because A, it's non-procreative, and B, in the biblical world, homosexual sex was part and parcel of pagan rituals. So it was very strongly frowned upon. It's the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah makes it very plain that the Bible disapproves of homosexual sex. So it used to be that people said, I am wrong with God. That I know I shouldn't be gay, but I'm going to be gay, or I can't help but being gay, or these urges are too great, or whatever. And I'm not passing judgment on the decisions they made. The point was God was right and they were wrong, and they knew it, and they justified it however they could. What's so interesting now is that the new attitude is from people who profess to believe in God, is that they are right and God is wrong, and God has to get with their program. I thought of that simply because of a story out of the New York Post just today. Rainbow flag waving vandal defaced NYC churches with anti-Christian statements. So some of them are just coming out as totally anti-Christian. The story in pertinent part says a hateful vandal carrying a rainbow flag defaced at least 3 New York churches with anti-Christian graffiti, according to cops still hunting the suspect. Someone cracked a soda. The pride flag-carrying suspect was also wearing a rainbow face covering when cameras caught them vandalizing the churches in far Rockaway, Queens, blah, 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 blah. So that's just open animus to religion. That's actually more honest than all these churches we're hearing about where it's all about God catering to them. So it's not hate the sin, love the sinner. It's that God is completely happy with this. There's an entire hymnal with pro-LGBT hymns. One of them is called Quirky, Queer, and Wonderful, and it describes all the permutations of LGBTQ plus-ism and says God just thinks everything's great because obviously God created it. And there's this whole thing saying that because God created man in his image, God must be transgender. He must be both male and female and pangender and polygender and whatever, rather than God created humans in the image of human beings, not cows, and then divided them in male and female, but that God himself, the Bible makes very clear, is a man. And Dennis Prager talks about the fact why it is important that God should be a man. You have reached a state of self-referential narcissism from which there's no going back when you claim to believe in God and that God had better get with your program. On that note, I'm wrapping it up and heading out for the day or the evening. Don't know when I'll be back. As always, thank you so much for listening. I really am grateful for the time you spend with this podcast.